Thank you, Jim. And Barbara, thanks for that not only gracious but beautiful introduction to us. Threefold thanks for inviting me. To the organizers of this conference for starting a conversation on what I think to be probably the most seminal and vexing issue of leadership. One of which we've just, tiptoeing in. This really remarkably rich issue. Secondly, to have this opportunity to share a platform with my pal and colleague and esteemed colleague, Jim Burns. Three, to force me to think anew about this topic. As Helen Vendler put it, to freshly imagine, to be given this opportunity to take another look at this topic of moral leadership, two daunting and taunting words. And in fact, it reveals, in preparing this talk, my own metaphysical pathos, my own conflicts and issues. I still have a feeling of anxiety and discomfort and queasiness about the topic of moral leadership, of morality, of just leadership. It's an issue that I have to admit up front that for most social scientists of my generation, the topic always causes a fair amount of discomfort and often get us to be weak-kneed. And in fact, I have in the past found it more convenient and even a privilege to claim ignorance rather than face up to the issues that phrase brings to mind. But I have to tell you a bit about my background to be clear about why this issue is sort of a difficult one, and one that really causes me to, again, think anew about this issue. Which is probably why I prefer, as Jim Burns does, the word values to morality, but that's another conversation. I want to tell you a bit about my upbringing, my socialization, becoming not a leader, but a social scientist. I went to a college, first of all, a really liberal arts and a really secular liberal arts college in the Midwest, where it was politically correct before the phrase had ever been coined. I remember one of the committees, the Race Relations Committee on campus, did not want to sing White Christmas. And in one of my lighter moments, I wrote a satire called Beige Noel, which I thought would be more. They did, however, have this anachronism on their application, which was church preference, and I thought I was being incredibly brilliant when I wrote down an answer to church preference. I wrote Gothic. And then I went on to graduate school, which was across the river, called MIT, where I had a degree which was called then Economics and Social Science. So I did a lot of my work here in this campus, in fact up to 50% here in this campus, and my economics on the other side of the river. And it was a marvelous opportunity to really cobble together a truly interdisciplinary degree, for which I will forever be grateful. Although I must say that the economists in my department, especially Professor Paul Samuelson, when I told him I was not going to do my thesis in economics, the look of palpable relief came upon his face. So at the time, we all worshipped at the shrine of tight-lipped logical positivism. We prayed practically, or certainly paid homage every day to the likes of Carnap and Wittgenstein. It's always nice to pronounce that name in seminars, Wittgenstein, and Quine, who is teaching here, and others that some of you here will remember taking courses with. And we were, incidentally, also, my generation, we woke every morning, it seemed, determined to change the world through multiple regressions with an assist from Boolean algebra. Also, in all fairness, my generation of social scientists were full of hope and full of a generous hubris. In fact, the first book I co-authored, and it was a book of essays and essays that the co-authors wrote and readings. Get this, it was called The Planning of Change. The idea, the hubris that we could figure out how to plan the idea of change. But it was also a very heady period, very period of being quite alive, being very much thinking that we really could make a dent in the universe through the kinds of writings we did. And the kinds of writings that the likes of me fell into, which was really the beginnings of organizational behavior, organizational theory, to take it from a social science point of view. So, in thinking, I used the phrase metaphysical pathos earlier. It was a phrase of a historian of ideas named Arthur Lovejoy, and what he really meant by metaphysical pathos were the values that you hold, that whether you know it or not, no matter how much you're trying to be, ladies and gentlemen, fiercely value-free, those values that seem to insinuate their way almost unpredictably, and sometimes for good effect, into our work, into even though we don't realize it's like not realizing you're writing prose, it's like that. And then I went back and looked over my writings over the last half century. And my first article I discovered, I've almost forgotten it, was published in 1954 in the MIT Graduate, this sounds like a oxymoron, the MIT Graduate Literary Journal. And it was called, it was in the Tech Engineering News. It was a student, a graduate student publication. And it was called Antigone, Billy Budd, and the Cane Mutiny, the Individual and Society. And I reread that. So, And then I couldn't resist, and I picked up a recent translation of Antigone by a local guy named Seamus Heaney, who, among other things, won the Nobel Prize for Literature a few years ago. He retitled it, called it Burial at Thebes. It's a remarkable translation. And I'm going to read you a section of it, try to give you a little reading of a conversation between Tiresias, the blind seer, who had a fabulous career, a man, and then, depending upon whose word you want to believe, either Athena or Hera got pretty angry with him and made him the anger was expressed in making him into a woman, and then Hera excused him and made him back into a man. So he's had a pretty interesting career trajectory. From a gender point of view, so he's back, blind, but now a man. And he's having, and you know, that he's sort of trying to bring to Creon, the king, some truth to speaking to power. And he starts in. Creon said, Tiresias, you venerable man, what news have you brought to me this time? News that you would be well to heed. When did I not, prophetic father, heed you? And isn't that why your ship has stayed on course? You kept me right. I know it, in my bones. Then I know this, where you are standing now is a cliff edge, and there's a cold wind blowing. Why do you always put that shiver through me, Tiresias? Because I have the power to see and warn. I know things once I sit in that stone chair, and the birds begin to skirl above my head, but never in all my years have I heard the like of the screams and screeches that I heard this day. By the way, when he was a woman, learned to listen to the birds. They were the prophets, the words he picked up. Consider well, my son, he says to Creon. All men make mistakes, but mistakes don't have to be forever. They can be admitted and atoned for. It's the overbearing man who is to blame. Pull back, yield to the dead. Don't stop. All right. I'm all right, I promise you. All right. And isn't that why your ship has stayed on course? You kept me right, I know it in my bones. Know this then, when you are standing now, and it's a cliff edge, and there's cold wind blowing, why do you put that ship on? So, he says, Creon says finally, why am I standing out here like a target with every hour aimed at me? You, Tiresias, your whole fortune-telling tribe has bled me white, but not anymore. And Tiresias says, Creon says, does nobody realize that? And Tiresias says, honest advice is not a thing you buy. And Creon says, and witlessness has to be the greatest threat. As you should know, it's your problem, Creon. I don't want to trade insults with a prophet. It's an insult to imply I am a fake, and so on. I began to realize then that my basic interest has always been that Aaron Wildowski phrase, truth speaking to power. In fact, if I look through my writings, it seems that transparency, openness, candor, committing candor, like Tiresias, is what my key value in all of my writing. But this was written in 1954 when I was really a closet value person. I didn't, get open with it. And it's interesting that 10 years later, after tenure, I wrote an article called Democracy is Inevitable. And then I began believing that I could come out of the closet and be much more explicit. An interesting thing about the article is I co-authored it with an old colleague and friend of mine. His name is Phil Slater, and it was Phil's idea that we should both come out, so to speak, and really put our values on the table. And the article was called Democracy is Inevitable. It was published 10 years later in the Harvard Business Review. But the then editors decided that democracy is inevitable is too much of a simple, straight, declarative sentence. And though they had the temerity to publish it, they changed the title to be more emollient, to be Is Democracy Inevitable, which I thought was interesting. So in that article, we wrote about several principles of a democratic society. And 4 of the principles we wrote about very quickly are these. 1, full and free communication. This is, by the way, 10 years after the Antigone piece. Full and free communication, regardless of risk and power. 2, influence based on competence and knowledge rather than the vagaries of personal whims or prerogatives of power. 3, an atmosphere that permits and even encourages emotional expression as well as task-oriented behavior. And finally, the leader must be willing and able to set reliable mechanisms of feedback so that the leader can not only conceptualize the social territory of which she is an important part, but realize how he and she influences it. Now, for the wind-up and the pitch to you. I want to get to the central thesis. And the central thesis of my talk with you today is that transparency is inevitable. And I want to make that argument. But there were 2 things that were clarified in my own mind in preparing this. To me, regardless of all the writings I've done on the leader, I think the more important issue to me throughout my writing and the way I think is not leader, not moral leadership, but listen to this very, very closely, but moral institutions, moral systems, moral cultures, moral organizations. Now, this again was part of my social science training, especially by the work of Kurt Levine and Alex Pappas, because if anything, they taught us that groups and systems are real. They have real effects beyond what any set of resumes or individuals would ever have on the meaning and the life and the effectiveness of a corporation or any kind of an organization. Now a metaphor which I find very convenient, which may not go down well to your ears, because I want to name it something new, is that I believe that all systems have what's equivalent, and think of this as a metaphor, have an equivalent to a DNA. That is, all systems have some kind of a genetic DNA framework. And some genes, systems can be sick, can be dysfunctional, and others can be healthy. Take slavery, take oppression, take inequality, take some of the things Jim Burns was talking about. They are, in my view, sick. I can't call them genes, so I made up a word, which is org genes. I think every organization has org genes, some healthy, functional, significant ways that people behave in accordance with those values. And there are sick org genes in organizations. Sexism, inequality, classism. So that's the first thing I want to actually talk to you, but just mention to you in passing. Now, my second clarification is, I don't think transparency is just nice. I don't think it's just nice to be open. I think, and I want to argue to you, that it is not only a functional necessity for a healthy society and for the common good, but it is necessary in the long haul for organizational and democratic effectiveness. And I want to now end by giving you 5 reasons why I think transparency, just like democracy, is inevitable. I'll make it very quick. First is legislation. We won't spend a long time on it. It's just one of 5 important factors. Sarbanes-Oxley bill is an example. Second, boards of directors, more independent, more financially accountable, meaning that these days directors, when there are clear conspiracies to commit fraud, as is true in the case of Enron, WorldCom, and a whole bunch of others, individuals have to pay from their own pocketbooks, not through some, some corporate. Thirdly, results. I'll make this short and sit down. And I'm sorry for that distraction. I know it is. Thirdly, results. A lot of anecdotal evidence, but there's a lot more evidence that the results. Fourthly, leadership. Your leadership, it does start at the top. At last year's conference, I said that Ken Lay and Bernie Ebbers' failing is not simply their myopia, cupidity, or incompetence. It's their inability to create a company culture open to reality, one that does not discourage management from delivering the bad news. There's increasing evidence, ladies and gentlemen, that transparency, not opacity, is highly related to organizational success. Finally, and maybe most importantly, it's the power of the media, and especially the internet. And I can give you more and more examples of how the internet, especially blogging and bloggers, are making a change in how we conduct corporate life. The bloggers claim that they brought Trent Lott down, they brought Howell Raines down, they brought Dan Rather down. They've done a lot of things, but I do think that this is inevitable. It's not because keeping secrets will be impossible. I'm sorry I have to shorten my remarks. I thank you for your patience and understanding. And one thing about transparency, as is true in democracy, it's going to take courage and patience. Thank you.